Good morning. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word. I'm Barry Bryson, and we're going to conclude our study of First Peter today by reminding ourselves what we've learned about this book, this letter, and the highlights, some of the themes, the major themes of this letter. This letter is written at a particular time in history. It was written in the early 60s, written probably after Paul has been executed in Rome and shortly before Peter has been arrested and ultimately executed in Rome. So that's probably a short amount of time in the early 60s, 64 or so AD. And it's written as a manual for surviving Roman persecution, and it was used as such by the early church. There's a great deal of evidence that congregations around the empire in the 100s, 200s were teaching First Peter to new converts because it is a survival manual. Because off and on Christians were persecuted until the Edict of Milan in 313, when Christianity itself became a legalized religion. And so this was necessary, and this was probably used more than any other letter in the New Testament in the early history of the church. And rightly so. That's what this is about. It addresses the fact that we're going through an unimaginably hard time, but now we're imagining it because we're going through it. We looked at the annals of Tacitus and some of the Roman historians, and we talked about exactly what happened when Nero blamed Christians for the burning of Rome and began rounding up Christians and killing them because they were Christians, how they were used for sport in the Roman Forum. They were sewn into animal skins and thrown to the wild beasts. This is men, women, and children. And how they were covered in pitch and burned alive, stuck on high poles to serve as illumination in the night. Just the terrible persecution that was being endured. There was a movie out a few years ago, Paul the Apostle of Christ, which is about this time, shortly before and then including Paul's execution. And it shows all these things. And if you want to get a good visual on what that looked like and what the terror was like in the city of Rome for Christians, I think that movie does about as good a job as any. So he tells them, we've said this all along. Jesus taught this, and we've been telling you, this is what's going to happen. Jesus said in John 15, the world hates me and it's going to hate you. He says in chapter 4, verse 12, don't be surprised at the fiery ordeal among you, which comes upon you for your testing as though some strange thing were happening to you. He said, don't be surprised at this. This is not strange. This is what God's people have always endured. This is a book about self-awareness, about who we are in God's eyes and who we are in a sinful world. The world will have varying levels of hostility towards Christians, but it will always be hostile towards Christians, and we should get used to that and know that. We just have to be who we are and not allow the world to dictate how we react. It should not cause us to try to accommodate it so that we can avoid difficulty, soft persecution or hard persecution, and it certainly shouldn't turn us into angry, bitter people who lash out and want to strike back, because that's not who we are either. So he begins the letter, of course, saying this is who we are. What we are, who we are is God's children, and what we have is not going to be taken away. And we looked at that verse, chapter 1, verse 4, which uses those three words, which in Greek are alliterative, and they all rhyme. And it's impossible to reproduce that in English. To obtain an inheritance which is imperishable, undefiled, will not fade away, reserved for you in heaven. What you have cannot be taken away. This book is deeply theological. Even in the opening, he talks about the role of the Father, Son, and Spirit. According to the foreknowledge of God the Father, this is God's plan. By the sanctifying work of the Spirit, he's working on you. The Spirit is in you, working on you, and working on you in and through these experiences. that you may obey Jesus Christ and be sprinkled with his blood. Jesus is our Lord. He tells us what's right and what's wrong, and he gives us grace through his blood. May grace and peace be yours in fullest measure. So there's that self-awareness that we have to start out with, and that awareness of God. And we also saw how those opening verses were not just about Father, Son, and Spirit, which are repeated throughout this opening section, but also faith, hope, and love that are mentioned in those first few verses, that second trio. And so we have Father, Son, and Spirit, faith, hope, and love all woven into that introduction, which leads us to gird your minds for action. So it begins and ends. Remember, he ended, be sober, be alert. You have to have your head in the game. I mean, so that after he tells us who we are, who God is, and where we are in God's eyes, he says you have to have your head in the game. You've got to be ready for this. You have to be determined, and you have to think things through. He talks several times about communing with Jesus through these sufferings. Over and over again, talks about the precious blood of the Lamb that paid for us. Talked to us whenever we are suffering wrongly. That's what happened to Jesus. Servants, if you suffer wrongly, that's what happened to Jesus. And you get to fellowship with Jesus when you do this. He told us that our posture is the posture of submission. But that's not the same as saying a posture of obedience. He tells us that we submit ourselves to the human authority. We honor all men. We respect everybody. We love the brotherhood, chapter 2, verse 17. We fear God. We honor the king. We are not afraid of the king. We're not afraid of the king. In the same way, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were not afraid of Nebuchadnezzar. But they were submissive to him, to a point, until he asked them to disobey God. And they told him that. We don't have to defend ourselves. You know how good we are in your service. But we're not going to do this, and our God can deliver us. But even if he does not, we're not going to do this because God doesn't want us to. And so he tells us that we react from a place of submission. There are two key verses, and we're running out of time. I want us to notice also that he ends by saying we got to have strong leadership if we're going to get through this, talking about elders. He continues to talk about since Christ has suffered over and over again. This is what Jesus did. We're just communing with Jesus. But in 3, 14, 15, this is the key. This is the heart of the whole book. The only way any of this is going to work is if we sanctify Christ as Lord in our hearts. We're the ones who are sanctified everywhere else in all the New Testament. But in this verse he says, you need to sanctify Jesus. Set him apart. Put him on the highest position in your heart. In your heart. It's not just about what you think. It's got to be what you feel. It's got to be visceral for you. And it was for him. We know that. All the times Peter messed up, the one constant ever from the day he met Jesus was his love for Jesus, the magnetism. He was drawn to Jesus. Even though he was afraid, he went to Caiaphas's. And even though he had unfinished business with Jesus, he threw himself into the sea to swim to Jesus. He knows what he's talking about because it's the way he feels too. And he says, this has got to be internal. This has got to be visceral. You've got to love Jesus. You've got to love him. And you've got to make him first and foremost in your heart. And that's the only way any of this is going to work. That's the only way. Okay, well, I'm taking up now 9 minutes of your time. We're going to start with 2 Peter next time. I believe when Peter writes 2 Peter, he's in jail and about to be executed. But we'll introduce 2 Peter next time we're together. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes.